through different eyes. It had been one of those ordinary June days that somehow leaves you feeling like you've lived 3 of them. Mom had a root canal that morning, so we'd spent a good part of the day at the dentist before heading back home. By the time I shut the stand down for the evening and started up the driveway, June was giving way to dusk. It was later than I usually like to be out. Apparently, middle age has opinions about things like that. As I eased up the driveway, I noticed the fireflies. It was the first evening I'd really seen them that year. They drifted lazily through the yard, blinking on and off like tiny lanterns that had somehow escaped into the grass. I slowed almost without thinking. Fireflies have a way of demanding that you notice them. Then I realized I'd interrupted dinner. 3 deer looked up from the grass, almost in unison. For a moment, they simply stood there watching me. Then, just as suddenly, each one reached an entirely different conclusion. The first looked at me for about half a second before deciding I was absolutely not worth sticking around for. It turned and disappeared into the woods without another thought. The second stayed exactly where it was. It wasn't relaxed, but it wasn't alarmed either. It simply watched, as though it hadn't yet decided what kind of person had just pulled into the driveway. The third apparently believed introductions were in order. It took a few careful steps toward me, stopped to study me, then took a few more. It wasn't tame, and I certainly wasn't about to test the theory. It was simply curious. I remember sitting there laughing to myself. Apparently, my reputation among the local wildlife was inconsistent. The deer remain undecided. The wild turkeys, on the other hand, appear convinced we're family. I'll save that story for another day. But as I sat there watching those deer, I couldn't shake the thought that they had all looked at exactly the same person, in exactly the same place, at exactly the same moment, and somehow walked away with 3 entirely different conclusions. Nothing about me had changed, only the perspective from which they were looking. The older I get, the more I think people aren't all that different. For years, I believed that if someone misunderstood me, it was probably my responsibility to clear things up. If I explained my motives a little better, provided a little more context, or found just the right words, surely we would eventually arrive at the same understanding. Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. It took me a long time to realize that understanding isn't something I can manufacture for another person. We all see through the lens of stories that began long before we ever met. One person hears confidence and thinks she's capable. Another hears those very same words and thinks she's arrogant. One person sees a boundary and recognizes wisdom. Another experiences that same boundary as rejection. One person sees caution, another sees fear. The facts may be identical. The perspective rarely is. That realization frustrated me for a long time because I kept assuming that if someone reached the wrong conclusion, I simply hadn't explained myself well enough. So I kept explaining, clarifying, defending, and hoping that one more conversation would finally bring us to the same place. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. Eventually, I realized I had been carrying a responsibility that was never really mine. I can choose my integrity. I can't choose someone else's interpretation. That doesn't mean truth no longer matters. It does. Character matters. Words matter. Honesty matters. But perspective belongs to the observer. Integrity belongs to me. Learning the difference has quietly changed my life. It has freed me from trying to finish conversations that were never mine to finish. It has also made me slower to assume I completely understand someone else. After all, I'm looking through my own lens too. The deer still wander through the yard from time to time. Sometimes one runs. Sometimes one watches. Sometimes one still walks a little closer than I'm comfortable with. I still smile every time I see them. Not because I'm finally convinced that I'm safe, but because they've become a quiet reminder that every one of us is responding to the world as we understand it. Only God sees the whole field. The rest of us are simply standing in different places trying to make sense of the view from where we are.